Now, 2 weeks ago, there was an anniversary, 100th anniversary of something that happened. Can anybody tell me what it was? The outbreak of World War I. Absolutely, August the 4th, 1914. You know what they called this war? The Great War was the first name that they called it, but they called it something else too. The war to end all wars. If only it had been true. But of course, in 1939, the Second World War broke out, and they had to rename the Great War the First World War because it wasn't the last one. And today it looks a little naive to have thought that it would be the war to end all wars. There have been such a litany of wars that have continued on from that. And the history of mankind, of course, from its very origins is littered with war and with violence. Now this morning I would like to ask you to join with me on a journey as we start to explore a particular story. And it's the story of how Seventh-day Adventists dealt with the outbreak of World War I and that experience. Because you can imagine that they were in a bit of a fix. They were in a very tight spot. It was a difficult place to be. Who were they going to obey? The state, on the one hand, as it forced young men to take up arms to defend their country and fight the enemy, or were they to obey God? They found themselves, as I say, in an impossible position, because on the one side they had the question of would they be obedient to the call of their country, the law of the land, and on the other hand they had the dictates of their conscience and the word of God. They were in a tight spot, a little bit like Peter and John. You remember Peter and John when they were called up before the Jewish religious authorities and they were told, don't preach again in this name. You remember what they said? They said, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you more than to God, you judge. They were in a tight spot. Now this morning I'm going to be drawing on 3 sources for our reflections. The first source, of course, is the Bible. But a second source is research which was conducted, you might have seen it, by Victor Hulbert. Anyone seen that research? Victor Hulbert, who was here not so long ago. He's the communications director at the British Union Conference. He's done an interesting piece of research into the lives of those people in the First World War, Seventh-day Adventists and their actions as conscientious objectors. There's quite an interesting body of research on the British Union website if you're interested in looking. And the third source that I'll be looking at is a book which was written a long time ago, 1936. The church decided that it needed to document the position of the denomination since its origins on the question of war. And they called it Seventh-day Adventists in Time of War. It was about the experience of the church and church members in relation to the wars that they had experienced by that time. The Second World War hadn't happened, but there had already been a number of wars. The American Civil War, in which 500,000 people were killed. Very, very bloody war. The bloodiest war, in fact, that Americans have ever been involved in, the most costly to the United States in terms of lives. And then the First World War, and they wanted to document how Adventists had reacted to that. And if you're interested in that book, called Seventh-day Adventists in Time of War, you can actually download it, find it on the internet, and read it. It's 407 pages, but it goes pretty quickly, you know. So, now I've got to admit, I've always been interested in the causes of war. I'm not at all interested in the military tactics, in the campaigns. None of that has interested me. The bloodshed, not at all. But I have been interested in the causes of war. What is it that creates war? How come that there seems to be this imperative that sucks people into war again and again and again. And when I was at secondary school, one of my teachers, history teacher, he recommended a book which is very interesting called The Second International. It's written by a British historian called James Joel. And it makes for interesting reading because it tells the story of an international attempt to avert the outbreak of World War I. It tells the story of somebody called Jean Jaurès. Anybody guess what nationality he is? French. Anybody heard of Jean Jaurès? Nobody. Okay, well, he's an interesting guy because he was the leader of the French Socialist Party in the run-up to the First World War. Now, he called for a general strike in France, and he tried through his contacts in Germany to organize a European general strike, so that in Germany the German workers would strike and the French workers would strike at the same time. You know why? Because they thought if the workers don't work, then how can they mobilize the armies? If they can't mobilize the armies, there won't be any war. Good idea? Yeah, seems like a really good idea. And they met together in 1912 in the Swiss town of Basel, and they held a meeting, the German workers, the French workers, their trade union representatives, and they talked about what they would do and how they would organize this general strike that would prevent war from taking place. But you see, the problem was that 2 years later, from 1912 to 1914, doesn't sound like a lot of time, but 2 years, a lot can happen in how people think about their enemy, or people who come to be called their enemy. And during that 2 years, the press in France and the press in Germany were saying what bad people the French people are, and what bad people the German people are. And so by 1914, the trade union movements in France and Germany were no longer, their heart wasn't in the idea of a general strike, because they'd started to believe the propaganda that these people were bad people and we had to fight them. Those people were bad people and we had to fight them. And so Jean Jaurès' idea of the general strike, they couldn't get it to work. And that was very sad, very sad. But he didn't give up. So while others were sort of sleepwalking into this most calamitous of wars, Jean Jaurès spared no effort to try and avert it. His story is a poignant one because he was actually assassinated on the eve of the First World War. He didn't live to see the outbreak of war because he was killed on its very eve. And he was killed by a French nationalist who wanted to take revenge on Germany for the loss of Alsace-Lorraine in the Franco-Prussian War. You know, there'd been this previous war. Alsace-Lorraine had been taken by Germany. Now he wanted to get it back. And this particular province has passed backwards and forwards several times between France and Germany, and they couldn't forgive each other. And this man killed Jean Jaurès on the eve of World War I. Jean Jaurès today is still a hero of the political left in France. Now, you might have seen one or other program on television about the origins and the outbreak of that World War. He called it a world war. Why? Because, first of all, there were so many countries that were involved. I saw the list as I was looking at this, and there were a huge number of countries, very remote countries, that declared war. You have countries like Ecuador. I mean, how far away is that? You know, which were declaring war, and everybody was sucked in. And it was a world war also because the European powers which were fighting were world empires. You think of the countries that they were dominating at that time. And so everybody got sucked into this dreadful war. I remember, has anyone been to the trenches or some of the First World War battlefields here? Yeah. It's a really, really striking experience. If you get the chance, go and do it. It's very sobering. It's quite distressing in some ways, but it's very interesting. And there were two things that shocked me. One thing was, you go into some of the military cemeteries there, and you have thousands and thousands of these little white crosses, and every little white cross represents somebody who was killed. You know, you see many, many people, you think, wow, this was bloodshed on an awful scale. And there was a second thing that shocked me, and there's one particular museum, this was in Belgium, a place called Ypres, but the British call it Wipers, used to call it Wipers, but in French they call it Ypres. Near there were some dreadful scenes of carnage during the First World War, and you can go today and visit some of the museums and which record what happened. But I remember looking at some of these old slides, and you had the slides, early photographs of the war scenes, and as you were looking through, you saw people going into the war on horseback. I mean, it was nuts, wasn't it? Anybody read War Horse here? You know the story of Joey the warhorse and his survival. Many, many horses were decimated in that war. It was ridiculous as the horses were charging into machine gun fire, as men would do later. And horses, of course, were then replaced by the tanks, and you saw that in all of the photographs. But then you also saw something else, which I didn't expect to see, and you saw men, Indian faces with turbans who were fighting. And you were thinking to yourself, where do these guys come from? How come they got involved in that? And then you saw lots of African faces as well, and black faces who were also there in Belgium in the trenches in that period. And so when we talked World War, it involved everybody. No one was able to hide from the carnage that was involved. Now, much has been said about the causes of that war. You know, the implosion of Austro-Hungarian Empire, it's collapsing. You've got the Serbian minority within Austria-Hungary who want to be part of a greater Serbia. And you've got, as well, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand by the Serbian radical who did that. Maybe you listened to the Radio 4 program. I don't know whether you listened to it. It was really interesting. 1914, Day by Day. If you'd heard that program, it went through day by day the calendar, what would have been in the news, and you could hear the pressure building up towards the war, you know, towards that explosion on August the 4th. Did you know that that there was a link between some of the leaders at the time? Do you know Kaiser Wilhelm II? He was the leader. Where was he the leader of? Germany, yeah. And George V, Britain, and there was also Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, Russia. You know there's a connection between you know what it was? They were cousins. And we know our cousins, don't we? We know our first cousins are people we know very well. Isn't that true? And yet these three cousins couldn't stop this war, even though they made an attempt to do that, which just shows you what incredible power was driving, what sort of forces were driving these countries to war. And it reminds me, the fact that they were cousins, of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Remember the statue? You remember at the level of the feet? What is it? It's iron and clay. Yeah, you remember what that represented? Representing Europe, which is not united. And you remember what it said in Daniel chapter 2, verse 43. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. The idea that, you know, even though these were grandchildren of Queen Victoria, these three emperors, they could not actually prevent their countries from going to war. What an awful thing. What an awful thing that was. So on the one hand, you had someone like Jean Jaurès, who was fighting to mobilize the workers to strike. It didn't work. At that level. At the other level, at the top of society, you have these cousins who don't want to fight either. And that doesn't work either, which is to see what forces how strong the forces were that were leading humanity to the very brink of calamity. The devil is a liar and the father of lies. And as it's been said, he was a murderer from the very beginning. And once the war broke out, it was too late to back down. In the book written in 1936 that I referred to, Seventh-day Adventists in Time of War, the author says this. He says, when the Great World War broke out in 1914, there came a rapid transformation of sentiment among church people in relation to participation in war. Many church leaders who in days of peace had strongly condemned warfare were now active in support of the war propaganda. You see, by then it was too late to back down, because the deeper in the mire of the trenches the armies sunk on both sides, the harder it was to extricate themselves or speak against the sacrifices already made. How could they say that it was senseless that your son died in vain, that it was all an accident of politics, that this was a disastrous choice on behalf of leaders? They couldn't say that, because it would imply that the death of your son, or your relative, your cousin, your father, was in vain. And they couldn't say that on any side. So it would take 4 years, and the death of millions of men to literally exhaust empires engaged in this fratricidal war. Only when the empires were exhausted would this war stop. Now, much was said 2 weeks ago in the remembrance services of the sacrifice that was made on behalf of, I quote, our freedom. Beware the platitudes and the slogans that justify war. Wilfred Owen, you may have read some of his poetry, the First World War poet, and who died in that war. Ironically, he died 1 week before the armistice 11th of November 1918, and he died on the 4th of November. But he wrote a poem which you might know, Dulce et decorum est. Do you know that poem? Have you looked at it at school? It's an amazingly strong poem. But he condemned in that poem that old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria more, which means it is sweet and honorable to die for one's country. How did Seventh-day Adventists deal with that conflict in World War I? How did they react to that war propaganda? You remember the poster? Your country needs you, Gideon. Your country needs you. Yeah, that was the war propaganda of Lord Kitchener. How did they react when the government, 2 years into the war, at first it began, people volunteered. They talked themselves into going. Their wives said, go and be patriotic. They went and they've signed up, they volunteered. By 1916, nobody was volunteering anymore. The government's running out of men. You know what they say? They say all men of that age will be conscripted and will fight, and we will send them away. Called it conscription. 1916, these compulsory orders for all young men to sign up to serve in the armed services were sent out. And if they didn't go, then there would be consequences. How did the Seventh-day Adventists at the time react? Would we be ready to stand as they stood? Some of you might have been up at Prestatyn. Anybody who was up there at the camp meeting in Prestatyn? No, nobody who was here today at least. But if you'd been there, you would have heard Victor Hulbert talking about that in his research. And he told the story of the Seventh-day Adventist conscientious objectors at that meeting. Anybody tell me how many Seventh-day Adventists there are nationwide here today, more or less, in the UK? It's about 36,000. Keeps increasing. Was 32,000 a few years ago. You remember we have the, periodically every year, we have the power of 31,000. The next year we have the power of 32,000. And now we have the power of 36,000, which is coming up, because it is increasing, the number of Seventh-day Adventists in this country. But anyone would like to hazard a guess at how many there were in 1914? Joe? Oh, Antonio, what do you reckon? 500? It was a bit more than that. More than that? Less than that? 2,500. 2,500 people there were in 2,500 Seventh-day Adventists in the UK in 1914. Yeah. And many of them were conscripted. There were 130 Adventist men who were called up and said, you will fight. You must fight. And they were called up to serve in the armed forces. Now, many refused on the grounds of conscientious objection. They refused, and they paid for it, because 17 of them were sent to prison on Dartmoor, you know where Dartmoor is. Even today it's got a bad reputation as a prison, doesn't it? And they spent a long time in that prison. And there were other prisons also. There was the Wakefield prison, there was Knutsford prison. Other Adventists were sent to those prisons. And it wasn't a soft option, because one of the survivors, sons of the former prisoners and conscientious objectors, said prison had to be worse than the trenches simply to discourage deserters. Imagine how bad that was. There was a particular group that Victor Hulbert talked about. He was 14 men. They were studying for theology in the Newbold of the time. It wasn't called Newbold then, it was called Stanborough Training College. And those 14 men given their papers and told, you must go and serve in France. And they were packed off, shipped off to France, and they said, you know, we can't fight. When they found a way around it, they said, all right, okay, you're not going to fight, you're going to act as labourers at the port. And so for a couple of years, until 1917, they were busy loading and unloading ships, these 14 men. But then there was another problem that emerged, and it was the problem of not working on the Sabbath. How are they going to get around this? You know, there's the war effort going on. You've got to work all the time. If somebody tells you to do something, you have to do something. And they said they refused to work on the Sabbath. These 14 men were court-martialed. You know what a court-martial implies in a day like that? It might imply that you'll be sent to the firing squad. They weren't actually sent to the firing squad, but they were put in prison. Military prison number 3 in Le Havre, which is the port in the north of France. Their story is one of courage and conscience in the face of brutal and inhuman treatment. If you want to know more about that story, have a look online at the BUC website. But writing years later to a young man about his experience, one of the prisoners, one of these 14 men, a man called Worsley Armstrong, he wrote this: I will not go into the details of the horrible treatment we received. But finally, each one of us was cast into a small cell, approximately 7 foot by 4 foot, with iron walls and a concrete floor. It was midwinter. And there, after punishment, our hands were placed behind our backs and locked with what were called figure of eights. These were metal figure of eights like that, locked, you imagine, and they were tight, so tight that some of them bore the marks even after the war. These men lived with the consequences of that experience for the rest of their lives, and at least 2 of them died earlier as a result of it. And you know what? After standing up for principle and in this very, very brave way, you know what happened to them after the war? After the war, they were called conchies, which is like cowards, and when people would see them in the street, they would put white feathers on them to stigmatize them for what they had done as cowards, even after the end of the war. But on what basis did they refuse to fight? Would I be able to stand for principle like them? Tough one, isn't it? A really tough one. Now, the book that the Seventh-day Adventist Church commissioned in 1936, which reviewed the attitude of church members from the outset of the foundation of the denomination, they looked at the issue. They looked at examples of people who had stood up against war in the American Civil War, in the First World War, and in other wars as well. And they produced in this book a series of articles on this subject which appeared in church periodicals like the Review and Herald and so on, as well as Ellen White's remarks on the subject, their catalogue too. And they provide the main reasons why Seventh-day Adventists have chosen to be non-combatants. Why wouldn't they fight? Any ideas? David put his finger on it, didn't he? Thou shalt not kill. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. To kill is to take life. If you're a soldier, it becomes a professional obligation to take life, doesn't it? And that's why these men refused to do that. Now, you might have noticed that in some of the newer translations of the Bible, for instance, the New King James Version, this commandment has been watered down. It doesn't read that anymore. It doesn't say, thou shalt not kill. It says, you shall not murder. Now, this turns on how you should understand the Hebrew word ratzah. Is it kill? Is it murder? But whatever, we should look this morning at what Jesus' thought was on this matter. What was Jesus' thought on this matter? Think about the Sermon on the Mount. And you think about how in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus challenged, he illuminated, he expanded the traditional understanding of God's law within Judaism. You know what Jesus said in his famous antithesis? What did he say? You have heard it said that, but I say unto you. Yes? Was Jesus revoking the law? He wasn't, was he? No. He wasn't overhauling the Ten Commandments, was he? Remember what he said? He said, for assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. I was excited in studying Hebrew at Newbold because I learned what a tittle was. I didn't know what it was, but a tittle is a little till. It's a tiny little mark on the top of one of these letters which denotes the letters. So when you say not one jot or one tittle, a jot is also a Hebrew letter as well, the smallest one actually, a yod, the smallest letter. Then what Jesus was saying is, it's like not one dot on an I or one cross of a T will be changed to the law. You know? So he's saying it's not changing. And not one will be passed until from the law until all is fulfilled. So he wasn't doing away with the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are still there and still valid, yes. So what did Jesus think about how or whether his followers should bear arms? Because for the Christian, Jesus' authority is what counts, isn't it? And his teaching. It wasn't different from the law, as we just saw, but it did illuminate and provide insight into the law. And what he said in Matthew 5:43 is something which is relevant to our discussion. It was this right at the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. And he says this, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. You've heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Wow. Now, is that easy to do? Love your enemies. Viv was mentioning it this morning. I wasn't in the lesson study, but I understand you were talking about this morning. Love your enemies. What about if your enemies had killed your family? Would you be able to forgive? Sharp intake of breath, huh? I think it would be impossible to do without the grace of God and the presence of the Holy Spirit in your lives and our lives. We once had a pastor in Belgium. He was the pastor who baptized me, actually. He was a guy called Georges Stephanie, and he wrote a book. His book was called La non-violence de Dieu et des hommes, which means the non-violence of God and men. And he was, when we knew him in his late 70s, he'd lived through World War II, and he'd been a prisoner because he was Belgian. He'd been a prisoner in World War II, and he explained how difficult it was to forgive his captors. He managed to do it, actually. He went back after the end of the war. He found some of the people who'd imprisoned him, and he made a deliberate effort to forgive them. But incredibly difficult thing to do. As human beings, we find it hard enough to forgive people who even say something against us, let alone do something against us. And now Jesus is asking us to love our enemies. And we could talk about this a lot. But one thing is pretty clear, because as one Adventist commentator wrote, do we fulfill this command when to love your enemies when we blow their brains out with a revolver? We don't, do we? We can't. Nor use any of the weapons of destruction at our disposal. Jesus was not sanctioning warfare. Far from it. Do you think this was an isolated instance? Just a one-off? Or do you think this was Jesus' line of thought? Well, shall we look at the biblical evidence? Let's have a look. You remember what Jesus said when Peter tried to defend him? It was the day of the arrest. The high priest had come down the hill from Jerusalem, bringing the soldiers with him to arrest Jesus. Jesus had betrayed him. Peter gets out his sword. He slashes at the high priest's servant. Malchus, we're told, is his name. And he cuts off his ear. Do you think he was going for his ear? No, he wasn't, was he? And what does Jesus say to him? He rebukes Peter. He says, put it away. Put your sword away. For all who take the sword will die by the sword. Ooh, that's heavy, isn't it? What was Jesus saying here? Was he sanctioning warfare? No. Think about Jesus' own life. How he didn't fight back. How he didn't defend himself. Remember how the words of Isaiah chapter 53 are applied to Jesus' life. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before its shearers are silent, so he opened not his mouth. Would you have been tempted to react to Pilate? Yeah. If you'd been hit in the mouth by someone, wouldn't you have reacted? If somebody was going to kill you, wouldn't you react? But Jesus didn't defend himself. He didn't defend himself. And it was almost as though he was fulfilling to the very letter his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount when he said, you have heard it that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Incredible. Easy to do? Not at all. It's not in our human nature to react like that. Could this scripture be obeyed on the battlefield? Turn the other cheek. Could not, could it? So you see why the Seventh-day Adventists could not countenance being called up to serve. Did they have to have a deep-rooted faith? Did they need to understand the teaching of Jesus? They did, because even the churches were changing their attitude towards war once the war started, and they were justifying sacrifices on behalf of war. We need to be grounded, brothers and sisters, grounded to be able to take decisions of that nature. You remember when Jesus stood before Pilate and Pilate asks him whether he's a king. And he says, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight. but it isn't of this world. And he's not asking his servants to fight in a military or a martial sense. And Loyada read a very interesting text of the incident where he wanders into the Samaritan village, and James and John want to call down fire from heaven, and blitz the village. And Jesus says, "You do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." Jesus did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. Let us not go on false errands and find ourselves fighting on behalf of a different spirit. Now, there are lots of biblical passages which we could have looked at which say the same thing. And the military man understood it. Two examples. Duke of Wellington. The Duke of Wellington, who was the victor at Waterloo over Napoleon, he said, "There's no place in my army for those with soft religious scruples." He understood that the two things didn't mix. Napoleon said something really interesting. You remember that Napoleon, first he was defeated at Waterloo and he wouldn't give up. He came back. 100 days he tried to raise France again. Actually, no, first there was an initial fight, then there was the 100 days, then there was the Battle of Waterloo. And after the end of the Battle of Waterloo, he was exiled to a very distant island, St. Helena. And there he had time, 10 years, to reflect on his life and to meditate on his misfortune. And what he said was this. He said, "Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and myself founded empires. But upon what did we rest the creation of our genius? Upon force." This is Napoleon who wrote this. He said, "Jesus Christ alone founded his empire upon love." Napoleon who wrote this. "And at this hour, millions of men would die for him." Amazing. So what of today, where we find ourselves in a very, very complex and delicate and difficult political situation at all sorts of levels? We think of Ukraine and that country which is imploding in the same way that Austria-Hungary imploded prior to the First World War. We think of Israel and the intractable conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This awful one-sided conflict which is constantly erupting and looks so difficult to get out of. Because just when a peace looks like it's going to break up, then there's another rocket that comes. And then, because there's so much hatred which is there, and it's being stoked all the time, not just within that community, but within the wider world. And then we think about the situation in Syria or in Iraq as well, with ISIS and everything that's going on there, with the Christians being driven out and the Yazidis being driven out, and that hugely problematic situation. Yes. And today we think how much more difficult it is than even prior to the First World War, because the technology is worse than it was then. The weapons of destruction are more widely spread than they were then. And I'm sorry to say that it seems inconceivable that this commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," will be adopted by any government anytime soon. Wouldn't it be great if every government of the world were to adopt that commandment and put it into practice, "Thou shalt not kill"? What a difference that would make, not just to domestic life within their borders, but to international life and strife. It would eliminate that if they were to adopt that one commandment. Are they likely to? I'm afraid not. The deep sense of realpolitik is too deeply embedded in man's mind to do away with warfare. Yet Christ calls us still to be peacemakers. What did he say in the Beatitudes? He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." Even as the world of politics looks so fraught and so unstable and so disastrous right now, we can look forward to a new day. Because a new day is coming. A new day is coming. And this is the hope that united those Seventh-day Adventists in the First World War, and it can unite us today, the hope of the second coming of Christ. Because as John wrote in the book of Revelation, he said, "And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away." And later on he writes, "And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away." One day, all of the carnage and the bloodshed and the violence and the evil of men will be passed away, but distant memory, something erased. And we will be there living with God. As we wait that day, may we remain true to God's principles, no matter what it costs us, and may God hasten the coming of that day. Amen.